Welcome to a special edition of How to Fix Democracy, celebrating International Democracy Day. Our special guest today is Danilo Türk. He's the former president of Slovenia and the current president of the Club de Madrid, a 20-year-old international organization dedicated to rethinking democracy. Danilo, welcome to How to Fix Democracy. Why should we be in the business of rethinking democracy? Both our show and your organization are focused on rethinking democracy. What's the need to rethink it?
Well, thank you, Andrew. Thank you for having me on your show, and thank you for your question. And to put the answer really in very simple form, I would say because democracy is in crisis. And it has been in crisis for a while now. Club de Madrid, for example, has discussed the questions of challenges to democracies in our century. In 2014, under the motto, democracy that delivers, the emphasis was democracy has to deliver results. And the feeling was at that time that democracies have become too much busy with discussing procedures and referring to values in a fairly superficial way, and the delivery aspect was neglected. Of course, things have changed since then, and they haven't changed to the better. So we are still perhaps in a deepening type of crisis of democracy, and we have to figure out what exactly the main problems are and what the solutions might be. And in doing that, in discussing these questions, we of course do not want to, to make an image of patronizing senior statesmen. We are part of the concerned public. We would like to help. We may have an idea of who that can be helpful, but please, we do not want to kind of suggest any sort of recipe, panacea, remedy, or anything of that ambition level. We would like really to be helpful by offering a bit of analysis, a bit of advice and suggestion. And then, of course, it's for current decision makers and the democratic public at large to see what exactly is necessary to move the debate on democracy and the quality of democracy further.
Danilo, your Club de Madrid, the club that you're the president of, was formed in 2001. As I said earlier, you're celebrating your 20th anniversary. What's changed on the democracy front over the last 20 years? We've talked to many experts in our series, and they've all suggested a decline, perhaps a crisis in the quality and nature of democracies around the world. Do you believe there's a crisis over the last 20 years, the decline of democracy?
Well, look, when Club de Madrid was formed in 2001, I was at that time working for the United Nations as Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs. And one of my jobs, my duties, was to follow the discussions within Club de Madrid, which was from the very beginning a very prestigious group. And the question of quality of democracy was put on the agenda immediately at the time of forming the Club de Madrid. However, at that time, the mode was really different. I mean, the mode of discussion was different, and the mood of the atmosphere was optimistic. It was expected, yes, we have achieved something, but further work for better quality of democracy is needed. Now, this has all changed over time, I think, especially since the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, which has produced effects that have really made the situation in many societies more difficult. The question of economic grievance has grown. The question of inequality has become much more serious than before. And little by little, we came into a situation which can probably be described as crisis. And I think that that's a valid description. This is not the first time in history that this sort of things happen. And let me tell you why I think we have to discuss it and have to define it as a crisis right from start. You see, democracies in general and historically have one weakness, and that is the weakness of complacency. Somehow democracies tend to believe that their procedures, their quality, their values guarantee good results, and that this will happen more or less inevitably. That's the complacency part. There is a British theoretician, Professor David Runciman from Cambridge.
Yes, he has been on the show. He was on our first series. He's an old friend of the series.
Sure, and he has written a book, Complacency Trap, or Confidence Trap, rather, where he described, and that was, well, more than 10 years, 15 years ago, perhaps, the problem of democracies as being relatively slow in responding to challenges, which may at the beginning look economic, technical, non-political, but grow into a political problem for the democratic systems themselves. And I think that his analysis is very valuable and helpful. I hope to have his participation in our discussions later in this year. And obviously, if one looks at history, one could see that this sort of periods of crisis happen periodically, and we live in one of them. And we have to figure out what the crisis is and what would help moving democratic societies out of the crisis. Again, with all the necessary humility, all the necessary realism, and as Club de Madrid is concerned, without a trace of paternalism or, sort of lecturing anybody. We are all involved in a search, and we have to discuss things in the process of that search.
Danilo, I'm a big friend and admirer of David Runciman. I'm not sure, though, he would cheer you up at your Rethinking Democracy Forum, because for David, democracy is in middle age, and middle-aged people are complacent. I'm not sure he believes that we can turn back the clock. I'm not sure he believes that we can make democracies youthful, vibrant, energetic again. I assume you disagree with him.
Well, I mean, we would need to discuss this. This is, of course, a valid hypothesis, which I do not share. I think that we can reinvent the liberal ideal, but it will have to be reinvented, not simply kind of reinterpreted or recalled. I mean, it will have to be reinvented. And the liberal ideal is what changed the world in 1980s and 1990s, where the number of democracy has grown, and where we have seen movements like the movement of new and restored democracies, which started in the Philippines with Corazon Aquino, and later moved to Nicaragua with Violeta Chamorro, and then spread in East Europe, where practically every leader followed that same movement. Now, that movement came out of nowhere, so to speak, I mean, in late 80s or 90s, and the whole commitment to the liberal ideal became strong unexpectedly. Of course, human rights agenda became much more powerful and much more transformative as a result. And then in the end, we have seen a major transformation in the 1990s, which showed that democracy, which was at that time already in its middle age, and it was not a youthful phenomenon in politics, has its inner strength, has an inner strength which can be reinvented in new circumstances, and then also help in developing a good understanding of the values, which we don't have at present. I would agree with that. I mean, we talk about values a lot, but that's very superficial. A real improvement in procedures. I think we are very hesitant to open up the question of democratic procedures seriously, and also then put the question of results much more centrally in the discussion, especially now with the experience of COVID-19, where we have seen that democratic systems have not performed ideally, and that their international coordination was a big problem, and in some ways failed. So you see, we have many reasons to kind of look at things critically, but not in a defeatist way.
In our first series, Danilo, we spoke to Larry Diamond at Stanford University. I think he's one of the world's leading authorities on the arc, the narrative of democracy. Yeah. And like you, he talks about the key year, perhaps, in the decline of democracy not being 1989 or the 1990s, but actually 2008 and the financial crisis. Oh, sure. And we dedicated our second series to the question of whether capitalism and democracy, particularly the free market, globalized capitalism of the 21st century, is indeed compatible with democracy. And many of the people we spoke to, including leading economists like David Collier from Oxford University, Angus Deaton, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics, they're all very skeptical. Some of them are openly critical of capitalism. What's your take, both as Danilo Türk and also as the president of the Club de Madrid, in terms of this compatibility between free market, what some people might call neoliberal capitalism, and democracy?
Now, I will have to tell you what my personal opinion is, because in the Club de Madrid, we haven't discussed this question as directly as you put it, but I would like to give you a direct answer. And my personal direct answer is, well, somebody will have to adjust, either democracy or liberal capitalism. And I think that capitalism in the past has shown an incredible capacity to adapt to new circumstances, which of course did not happen voluntarily in the usual circumstances. That should be possible today. Now, let me give you a couple of examples in which ways I think this could and should be done. First, if one takes the big in fourth industrial revolution, as we call it today, the fourth industrial revolution, big data, artificial intelligence, quantum computing as a matter of future, and so forth. I think the question of ownership of data and management of data will have to be put before decision makers as a fundamental political problem. Who is going to prevail, people or companies, people or government? So that's a challenge for democracy, and I think people who are serious about democracy shouldn't shy away from that problem and should address it. Now, Club de Madrid is currently having a series of meetings with organized together with Boston Global Forum on the question of how to, address the problems of digital society, artificial intelligence, so forth. That's one example, and that's where I think the question will be given an answer in a few years. The second question, which I use as an example, and is closer to politics today, is relates how do we deal with the socioeconomic consequences of COVID-19. Because COVID-19 has created a lot of damage to societies, and there will be a need for repair. And that repair would require heavy investment in health systems, educational systems, greater social justice, reduction of income inequality and such things. And of course, these things will become practical. Can democracy tolerate the tax havens and tax evasion on the scale in which the liberal capitalism has produced in the past 2 or 3 decades or 4 decades, perhaps? Well, that's an important question. And the question of social development will very, very importantly be a test question for democracy of the future. Now, I'm not, underestimating the magnitude of the tasks or the dangers involved, but I think that it is becoming clear what kind of issues have to be resolved if democratic systems are to survive and to reinvent the liberal democratic ideal.
In our first series, Danilo, I also went to Budapest to talk to Michael Ignatieff, the Canadian political thinker, politician, writer, teacher. And at that time, and I think he still is, the president of the Central European University. He's on the front lines of the struggle against what we might think of as this new neo-authoritarianism or illiberal democracy or illiberal capitalism. There are lots of terms to describe it. We, of course, have that phenomenon in Hungary, in Poland, in Russia, in Turkey, in the Philippines, in Brazil. We may have even had it in the United States with Donald Trump. All those phenomena happened before COVID. So I take your point on COVID, but the growth of a neo-authoritarian politics, a disdain, a disregard, a disrespect for democracy happened before COVID. In addition to the inequities of globalized capitalism, how would you explain the growth of this neo-authoritarianism around the world? As I said, from the Philippines to Brazil, to the United States, to Central Europe.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. I mean, the problem that I mentioned relating to social consequences of COVID is not a consequence of COVID. I mean, the COVID did not produce the problem. The COVID has deepened the inequalities, deepened the divisions in societies. It has deepened the cleavages that existed earlier. In that sense, of course, it has been an accelerator of problems which were there before. And those problems had to do, obviously, with the ways in which liberal capitalism has developed over decades, and which shows that, the time for serious change has come. And the first indications were precisely in the form of the diminished trust of people in democratic institutions and the resulting growth of reliance or hope for strong leaders, strong hands, strong visionary leaders, or leaders who can, disregard the complicated procedures and simply tell what the future will be. That's how the idea of illiberal capitalism started to grow in East Europe. It of course got the main expression in Hungary, but you can see the elements of that elsewhere, and that shows also the weakness of the earlier liberal democratic ideal, which has driven the transformation of East Europe in late 80s and throughout the 1990s. So that phenomenon was there. It is largely related to the functioning of liberal capitalism, but not only to that. I mean, usually political phenomena have many sources and historic reasons and all kinds of things that make the resort to the illusion of strong leaders possible or stronger than one would have hoped. So that is how I see the evolution. I'm glad that you discussed this with Michael Ignatieff, who is a good friend of mine and whose writings on human rights I respect very deeply, and who was there in Budapest when all these things were happening, but had to move the university to Vienna because the environment became too difficult for the kind of liberal democratic institution which Central European University is, in essence. And that's of course one of the paradoxes of development of the past 2 decades. Now, you see, I'm not suggesting that I have a solution to all this. I'm just trying to tell you what I think about the problems, how I see the problems, and where I see the needed movement ahead. And once again, I think that there are some big issues, very difficult ones, which will have to be addressed very soon, and I hope they will.
Danilo, you are the president of Club de Madrid, which is a club of former presidents and prime ministers, mostly from democratic countries around the world. Tell me if this question is unfair, but it seems to me as if the more vital the more energetic, the more populist politicians, representatives of the people who are successful, tend to be skeptical and sometimes outrightly hostile to democracy. What's happened to the FDRs, the Churchills, the Lech Walesas, the democratic politicians who are able to capture the imagination of the people? Is it just my imagination, or is there a crisis for representative politicians grabbing the attention of the people, becoming a symbol of innovation and hope? What's gone wrong with representative politicians in democratic systems? I know it's a generalization, but there seems to be some truth to it.
Yeah, very probably, yes. But the names that you mentioned all became great names of democracy after they have fought non-democratic or anti-democratic or directly totalitarian dangers very directly in a very open battle. Each of them has grown in battle. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt in New Deal first, and then World War II afterwards. Lech Walesa, on the other hand, in the final phases of struggle against the Stalinist version of communism in Poland and so forth. So, I mean, they all became great as a result of struggle that they successfully led against very serious odds and very anti-democratic forces that were dominant at their time. Now, the paradox of Lech Walesa is that he was subsequently, when another wave of history came, accused of having been, kind of an agent of the communist secret service, which is nonsense, which he was not. But I mean, this shows you a little bit the paradoxical nature of political change in that part of Europe. Now, I hope our generation is retired. You see, we are former presidents, and none of us has political ambitions. We may be invited to do one thing or another to help a little bit here and there, but we are not campaigning for anything. So our generation is already out of the battle in a certain way. But I think the next generations of politicians will have to fight precisely those battles. And I hope that there will be people who are genuinely devoted to democracy, who are capable of dealing with social consequences of liberal capitalism and COVID-19, and who are able to manage the problem of big data in a democratic fashion. Now, that's a challenge for political leaders. And one difference between political leaders and academic people is that, see, I was both. I was teaching, for many years, and then I was in diplomacy and politics, so I have tasted a little bit of all these different worlds. And one big difference is this: if you are only an analyst or a scholar, you have a fairly comfortable situation, because what you do is you describe, analyze facts as they evolve. But if you are a politician, you change facts, whatever you do. Even you don't do anything, things take their course. And the question is, why didn't you do certain things when it was timely? So politicians have a much more difficult task, changing the world. And they can change the world by having a program, having an objective, having a true commitment to democratic values, or they can simply let things happen, or are, otherwise incapable of shaping themselves the course of events. And then, of course, that's a way of changing reality also. And politicians can very easily fall into that trap of passivity that allows things to happen in an undesired direction.
Danilo, you mentioned your generation. We, of course, know the great Who song, My Generation, which captured the imagination of an entire generation in the 1960s. One of the things we've tried to do in this show is talk to some younger people about the kinds of democracy and world they want to see. You brought up COVID. We've talked, of course, about liberal capitalism and the compatibility between free market capitalism and democracy. But one thing we haven't talked about is global warming and the environment. I know Club de Madrid is very much committed to this. And one of the things that has come up in many conversations that we broadcast with younger people is their focus on the environment, their disappointment that our generation, and I would include myself with you, have let them down. Is there some truth to this? Has our generation failed? And is there really a profound generational divide when it comes to the great issues now confronting democratic societies?
Well, I think that in essence, the answer is yes. I think that our generation has failed and failed quite badly in that regard, in the regard of dealing with the challenges of global warming in a timely and effective way. I mean, we clearly didn't do our job. We talked a lot about that clearly, but that was not serious. And the question is, but that was not effective enough. I mean, you know, I'm not suggesting it was not meant seriously, but it was not effective. Now, the question really is whether it would be possible to build a political platform on the concern for humankind. I mean, because you see, the planet will survive anyway. I mean, the planet has survived dinosaurs. Why it couldn't survive the Anthropocene, the human, human species. So, that's not the question of the planet. That's the question of humankind. And obviously now we see that the threat is real, and that something very serious and transformative has to be done, not only talked about. Now, I'm very supportive of what President Biden is trying to do, to put this question really centrally in the agenda, and then spend trillions of dollars for changes in the energy sector, changes in infrastructure, and so forth. I mean, this is now starting to show seriousness. We'll see how much else or how much more can be done, and that will be visible at the conference in Glasgow and on other occasions. We are still, of course, at the level of broad projections. I think the critical question will be how much will be done between now and 2030, let's say next 5 years and next 10 years. I mean, that's the period in which decision makers will have to manage big changes, which are technologically doable as we hear, but require investment, require political change, require many things which are not in place as yet. Therefore, I mean, my generation has failed, but my generation also has people in decision-making places who can save the planet, so to speak. President Biden is one of them. I mean, he's older than me, but he belongs to basically the same generation. And there are others. Sometimes
Erin Brockovich, the great environmental activist, wrote a book saying, with the title "Superman Isn't Coming." Her point, and I think many environmentalists will accept this, is that a single individual, whether it's Joe Biden or Superman, they can't save the planet. This is a generational and a collaborative thing which needs to be addressed through democratic infrastructure, through what you would call procedure. Isn't that true?
You're absolutely right. And when I talk about Joe Biden, I talk about personality who is not there alone as a Superman. He's not a lone rider. I mean, he is actually a pinnacle of a system which exists in the United States, which is perhaps emerging and getting stronger. And of course, the ultimate success will depend on how all this, the whole system behaves and how it changes. I mean, it's not only government, it's also people in the academia, in business, in local administration and civil society and all that. I mean, of course, it takes a great deal of political talent and magic to mobilize all this for single cause or for a critically important cause. And in that sense, Joe Biden has a terribly, heavy burden to carry, but he's not alone. And he did not become president as person. I mean, he became president as person, supported by a solid and already fairly large constituency. And now, of course, the whole constituency is challenged. It's not Joe Biden alone, not Superman alone. I mean, he depends vitally on this larger cluster of participants, which goes from government to civil society across all sectors. And I believe that there are people in all these sectors who can help and who can make a difference.
Danilo, your life, it seems, is made up of two quite different worlds, two quite different chapters. On the one hand, you're from Slovenia. You were the president of Slovenia, a very small post-Yugoslav country that was the most democratic, the most successfully democratic of the post-Yugoslav states. On the other hand, you're a man of international organizations. You ran to run the UN. You're very much involved with the United Nations. Now you're the president of the Club to Madrid. When it comes to democracy, Danilo, does size matter? Montesquieu always argued that small countries are more suited to democracy. Do you believe that? Because it seems as if small countries like Slovenia, Denmark, the Czech Republic, they're much more suited perhaps to democracy than larger countries like Russia, China, perhaps even the United States. What can small countries like Slovenia and your experience as a politician in Slovenia, what can you teach larger countries about making democracy work?
Well, I must say I disagree on both points.
Good.
First, I don't think that small democracies are somehow predestined to become more democratic. It's perhaps easier to handle some things in a smaller, when you have smaller population, a smaller territory, or, fewer problems or whatever. It makes it a little easier, but that doesn't guarantee democratic success. In Slovenia, right now, we have a government which is really giving rise to many concerns. I mean, right now, at this moment, I'm very worried about how, this COVID and post-COVID situation is handled by our current government, which shows signs of democratic deficit. So, I mean, I'm not supporter of the theory that, well, small may be beautiful, but small does not kind of guarantee democracy. And if you take, for example, Germany, which is a large country, we see that democracy works very well in Germany, really, at present. And I would like to take additional courage from the German example of the past weeks. I mean, Germany has shown that it is able, that people are able to, grasp the spirit of the time and lead the electoral process towards something that would be meaningful for the future. Now, that means that the Greens are, of course, stronger than before. Also, the recent success of Olaf Scholz is not completely surprising. Now, Olaf Scholz was with Gerhard Schröder in the past when this market-based reforms were made in Germany, but now he's more on the social side, which doesn't mean that he has become anti-market, not at all, that he's simply more attuned to the needs of the time. So I think that, large democracy like Germany functions well, small democracy like Hungary or Slovenia are not so good. And then when it comes to suggesting lessons to others, I would be very cautious about that. Of course, everybody can learn something from somebody else, but that's for the learner to do, not for that somebody else to teach. I think the beauty of democracy is that it is obviously open to learning and can absorb experiences from elsewhere, but it's not a very good export product. You don't impose democracy in a place which doesn't have sufficient demand for democracy. There has to be a genuine demand for democracy within the country concerned. Let us not forget, I mean, democratic legitimacy, in my opinion, is ideal. It's wonderful, and I'm all in favor of it. But that's not the only, not the only source of legitimacy. There may be legitimate forms of governance which are not entirely democratic, or which may be mostly non-democratic, and they cannot be changed by export of democracy from democratic countries. That has to be a more, there has to be a more careful, more sensitive communication. And don't forget, I worked for the United Nations for many years. So I'm speaking as a result of experience that I gained in that fascinating organization, which which is based.
Is that a euphemism, Danilo? Fascinating? Does that mean
no,
it's
no,
slightly
I'm truly
dysfunctional?
fascinated by the United Nations because it's based on the idea of inclusion. So everybody is included, and then obviously these are members of very different types. Some of them very democratic, some of them very undemocratic. Only South Africa was for a while excluded because of its racist system. But everybody else, I mean, it was not formally excluded, but it was not participating really. So, I mean, that's a fascinating system, but we should not think that that's the system which will generate democracy. No, it will generate communication, and democracy can be a good outcome in some situations, but not in all situations. So you have to be really very careful in handling that. And what may, the source of my fascination is really this ability to keep all these different types of governance in a single space, allow them to communicate, try to work out problems as they arise without guarantee of success. So that's the source of fascination.
Danilo, you mentioned data, big data earlier.
Yeah.
We've obviously talked a lot about the impact of the internet and the digital revolution on democracy. There are those we've spoken to who see it as the problem, fake news, the spread, the obsession with social media. Others believe that it represents, in peer-to-peer technologies, the fix, the solution to our democratic woes. Where do you stand on the digital revolution? Is it the problem, or is it the solution, or is it both?
Well, historically, it is both. In our moment, at this very moment, it's more a problem than a solution. And of course, if you take a sufficiently long historic period and say, well, if you look at history for the last 2000 years or something, you will see that, for example, the invention of printed press created a huge upheaval in Europe, let's say from beginning of 16th century until, I don't know, 18th century or so. And that led to wars. There were huge tragedies resulting from religious reformation that followed, and all this turmoil. But it was also an incredibly productive process which transformed Europe into a leading region of the world, which was not the case when the whole process started. So, if you take a sufficiently long period, you can always say, well, at the end, there will be something good coming out of it. Well, that's one way of looking at it. I'm not prepared to take this as sufficient for current policy making, because right now what we see is a takeover of big data by big companies and big government, and that's a problem for democracy. And this problem has to be put on the agenda squarely. We have a problem, and we have to figure out, if we want to maintain democratic rule, what kind of norms should govern handling the big data. We have seen, for example, with Cambridge Analytica, what happens if companies use this data for purposes which are at the end political, although at the beginning they don't look very political. In the beginning they look like simply improvement of information base that would furthermore later on lead to political judgment and political action. But we can't be, once we have seen this, once we have gone through that experience, we must be much more careful. And I think that right now, the dimension of danger is much more important and much more present than the dimension of promise and hope.
Danilo, our third series is focusing on citizenship and strengthening citizenship in democratic and non-democratic systems. At your upcoming conference, Rethinking Democracy, you talked about fixing some of the procedures, the processes of democracy. Yeah. How do we do that in order to strengthen concepts of citizenship, making people better citizens, which I would assume in turn would result in higher quality and more accountable elected politicians?
Yeah, well, there are things that can be kind of discussed in a more visionary visionary sense.
Please, I'd love you to be a visionary. I know sometimes in the world of international politics, you have to be practical, but please be a visionary for us for a moment.
No, I will disappoint you here, because I believe that, for example, just to give you a specific example, one would need to take a serious look at the electoral systems as they exist in various countries today. Now, of course, there is no single system, and there is no single formula that would last forever in a country. I mean, the countries have to know that electoral systems can also be changed, improved. But of course, it's very sensitive. This is a very sensitive thing to do. Let me give you an example. When Slovenia was becoming independent, we had to go through a process of the Conference on Yugoslavia, with the whole problem of succession and everything. That conference was chaired by Lord Carrington, a very distinguished British politician and international figure, highly respected, very decent man, and he commanded very high respect by everybody who worked with him. And I remember a dinner which we had back in late 91, when Slovenia was finalizing its constitution, and he wanted us to tell him about our electoral system. And he said, we were going to strict proportionality, proportional system. That's what we want. We had a strong man, Tito. We don't want any sort of concentration of power. We think coalitions will be the right thing for us. It's more difficult. It requires effort, but making coalitions is really a good thing, and we are going for that. And then Carrington said, well, I'm not sure whether you will have a country that can be governed, because in my experience, in the British experience, you have to have a majority system in order for you to know who is the government and who is the opposition, and that should be a kind of a stable relationship for a few years. So think about it. We didn't take his advice, and I think we were right. But right now, we see that we are not sufficiently good in managing the electoral system. We would need adjustment. We would need change if we want to have a better quality of parliament, and as a result, a better quality of government. And that's a difficult thing to do. And it is a priority, really. It's something that we will have to do. So that kind of bars me from taking an unduly visionary approach, because I know what decides the parliamentary elections tomorrow, which we'll have in Slovenia and possibly in early next year. You see, this kind of immediate questions are really important and dominant. And I know that in the United States also there are serious discussions about improvements of electoral system, which according to many analysts, is historically understandable. But
Larry Diamond spoke to us about that. He's a big supporter of reforming the electoral system and getting rid of gerrymandering.
Sure, and that's really a very important priority, which should not be set aside by visionaries and say, well, it doesn't matter what kind of electoral system it is, as long as you have the vision. It's not like that. You need to have an improved electoral system. And obviously, if you can, of course, it's good to have a good vision. And then when it comes to big data, I mean, Slovenia is not going to decide on big data. I mean, that's going to be decided in the United States, in the European Union, in the power, and of course, in European Union, we'll have a voice. We hope to be part of the discussion of how to manage that. European Union is trying to do, certain things. We'll see how far that goes. We hope that, there will be change in that regard. And as I said, on the social development, Club de Madrid has proposed to the United Nations to convene a summit on social development. I understand that Secretary General Antonio Guterres likes the idea. We'll see what happens with that idea in the report he is going to put before the General Assembly in a few days. And if that idea gains support, then it will provide an opportunity to talk seriously about what do we mean by market economy? How far does the market go? What kind of international coordination on taxation is necessary in order to ensure tax fairness? I mean, these are big things and can be handled only internationally. And that's part of my vision, if you want. that's the vision thing, as you Americans would say. that's the vision.
We like vision in America, although we're not always very good at carrying it out ourselves. Finally, Danilo Türk, the former president of Slovenia and the current president of the Club de Madrid, an organization of ex-politicians. Do you have a political hero, someone who you think epitomizes why we should have democratic systems, someone who is the model, a paradigm for a good democratic leader?
Well, I think that there are great figures in the democratic history. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt is clearly one of them. And I say this because, both being a former president and both being a UN official. I mean, one of the ideas of Franklin Roosevelt, again, not completely new. I mean, partly inherited from Woodrow Wilson, partly inherited from the great American constitutionalist tradition and all that. He has applied a very interesting idea to the organization of international community, and that has partly succeeded. So, his democratic vision, his, let's say, four freedoms speech, which kind of synthesized his idea, was translated into practical policies that changed America, practical policies that helped changing the world. Of course, they didn't create a heaven on earth. I mean, that would be too much to expect. But he has demonstrated that in difficult moments, democratic approach to solution of really big problems works, both in the United States and globally. So, I mean, Franklin Roosevelt is clearly like this, and his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, is also a very interesting, great figure with her sense not only about the importance of human rights, but also sense of detail in policy making and all that. The little I know about that part of American history tells me, well, America was lucky to have had leaders like this at critical moments.
We certainly were. Danilo Türk, the president of the Club de Madrid, it's been a real honor to talk to you. And I want to wish you the very best of luck with your Rethinking Democracy conference, your 20th anniversary event in October 2021. I'm sure it's going to be a great success, and I hope we'll have more opportunities to have you and some of your members on our How to Fix Democracy show. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for your wishes. I certainly need a fair amount of good luck. And I will be always ready to engage in a conversation about these very important things.